Hello, I'm Justin Mays. Joining me today is Dr. Mike Posner at the University of Oregon. Dr. Mike Posner has done a lot of research in attention, and Mike, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Justin.
So I thought we'd start off our discussion today just going over the basics of attention research, sort of how you got into the field and how it started and how it's evolved over the years.
Attention's had a very interesting history in psychology. It goes back to the very beginning of the field. And in fact, at the turn of the 20th century, one of the most famous psychologists, Titchener, said it was the centerpiece of the psychological enterprise. However, not very long thereafter, it fell into a little bit of a reduction in work as people got interested in behaviorism, and it was more difficult to see attention as a concept when most of the interest was in behavior itself. After World War II, and perhaps as a result of World War II, attention research came back. There were many problems with military actions during World War II, such as maintaining the alert state of soldiers when they were doing long jobs like looking at radar screen returns and so on. And also because people had to switch or sometimes do multiple tasks at the same time. And so right after World War II, there was a big resurgence in attention research related to the general interest at that time in so-called information processing, partly stimulated by the book on information theory, which Shannon and Weaver wrote, and partly from the military experience people had in the sort of practical world of actually having to deal with people who were having to maintain attention and prevent from making errors. A lot of the work was done in Britain, Donald Broadbent probably being the leading investigator in this field. And my involvement really began with reading Broadbent's 1958 book in which he discussed the role of attention. Most of the experiments involved presenting information simultaneously to each ear. So one ear would hear one message and another ear would hear another message. People were asked to repeat them in the order they were presented, but in fact they repeated all on one ear and then all on the other ear, as if there was a kind of bottleneck that held up information while one ear was being processed until it could be switched and attended to. And that really began a lot of interest in the field of attention, including my own. And although I didn't do a thesis on attention, shortly thereafter I began to work on problems of attention, partly on trying to understand what it was to obtain and maintain the alert state. So we looked at the effect of warning signals, both on performance, it actually sped performance, but also tended often to increase error. So people responded more rapidly, but with a little bit less information than they had when they would normally respond without a warning signal.
So being in an alert state caused this effect?
Yes, the alert state, of course, we didn't know very much about it then. We know a lot more now. But it did have this very interesting speed-accuracy trade-off, so people would be fast, but a little less accurate. And I was also interested in the selection of information from different modalities, that is, from either visual modality or auditory modality.
Right, because you did mention a little bit with Broadbent, and I know as well Ann Treisman did a lot of work with the auditory modality.
Exactly. Ann Treisman was worked with Broadbent, and she spread the information on attention to more than one modality and developed a kind of filter, variable filter approach to dealing with the sensory modalities. And my own work was interested in, mostly I dealt with visual information. In our work, it was a lot easier to present the information visually, and you didn't have the problem of the message being spread out in time. So you always knew when to begin the movement of your clock to measure the speed of the person's response. And over time, I began to get interested in the problem of the selection of information for conscious experience. And I spent a lot of time trying to localize in time the exact time when people would become aware of the sensory message. It's an approach a lot of people have taken over the years.
So you've theorized on the sort of the three different components of attention. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, during the time of the information processing approach, I tried to distinguish between three aspects of attention, one of them being alertness, a second one being selection, and the third one being conscious processing. And I still have three components, but they've changed rather dramatically, mostly because of our ability to understand some of the anatomy behind these various attentional functions. And once we understood some of the anatomy, then that dictated a different way of thinking about the problem of attention, although maybe by coincidence or maybe just because I'm not too flexible. There's still three components. I call them alerting, same as before, and then orienting, having to deal with the selection of information from external sources. And I always distinguish between the place where attention can have its effect. Obviously, if it's a visual information, it has its effect in the visual system, and the source of that effect. Turns out that regardless of which modality you're selecting, whether it be visual, auditory, somatosensory, and so on, the anatomy of the source of that attentional effect is pretty much the same. And that turned out to be a big surprise to us and allowed me to think about an orienting system, which has been studied probably more than any other aspect of attention because it's so common between humans and non-human primates. And so their work using fMRI, for example, in humans, but also non-human primate work using cellular recording, for example. So orienting has probably been the best studied, and often attention is associated only with dealing with sensory signals. But of course, you know, we attend to our own thoughts, and we attend to memories that we have. And we were able to find that there is a higher level attention system, which I've called the executive attention system, whose purpose is to regulate information from other systems. So if you attend to an external source of information, that executive system will be coupled or connected to, let's say, the visual or auditory system. But if you are dealing with regulating an emotion, for example, trying to be less fearful when you're giving a public talk, then it might be coupled to a limbic structure like the amygdala. And so this has become the higher level process of attention, which is involved in what we might call self-control or self-regulation.
Okay. So you were talking a little bit about where these, the executive processes are going on in a certain central area of the brain, or a single area of the brain.
Not a single area.
Not a single area.
What we see with methods that have been developed, like fMRI, is that there's always a network of areas, usually widely scattered, not right next to each other, but a network of areas scattered around the brain that are the source of this particular effect. And for this executive attention network, the most important areas seem to be the anterior cingulate gyrus, right at the midline of the frontal lobe, and then the anterior insula, which is more lateral in frontal areas, and then parts of the basal ganglia. And these work together in ways that we really don't understand in detail to regulate the activity that's going on in other networks. So when there's competition, when you try to, let's say, stick to a main line or goal in the presence of distractions and so on, then this area allows the priority be given to the selected information, to the information that's fulfilling your goal. And therefore, it's obviously a very important area to study and understand, and there have been some progress in our understanding it.
So if these connected areas are sort of how you select and process information, would you think that that's where sort of consciousness resides in the brain, or do you believe this is independent?
Well, as I say, it's a network of areas, and it does play a role in some aspects of consciousness for sure. The way I think about it is that it's very important for what we might call focal consciousness, the thing that you're really concentrating on. If you're in a complicated, big room with lots of activity going on, you have general ambient awareness of the whole scene. And you might think you know about what's going on every place, but in fact, you only really have good awareness of some focal area on which you're concentrating. And this attentional network that I've described, this executive attention network, seems to be very important in the control of that focal aspect of consciousness. It's also very important in another thing that we call conscious, namely voluntary action. So when a stimulus occurs, I might decide to move toward it or move away from it and so on. And that decision is implemented or involves the activity of this executive attention network. So yes, it plays a very important role in consciousness, although there may be aspects of consciousness which are not involving this network.
Right. What about the sort of unconscious things, like the cocktail party effect, for instance, where you hear your name in a crowded room and suddenly you've oriented to that?
Yeah, well, this is a very important question. Much of what goes on in our brain is not available to consciousness, so that if you're listening to me, you may not be aware of information coming from your feet, but now that I've mentioned it, your feet may feel a little funny. And you can switch from one thing to another. Attention is very good in being switched by signals like movement or luminance, changes. So if you have a change someplace in the room in luminance or movement, you'll tend to orient, maybe even involuntarily, to that stimulus. But in recent experiments in so-called attentional blindness, when those cues are suppressed, so somehow you get rid of the motion, get rid of the luminance, you can have drastic changes outside the focus of attention, and one is completely unaware of those changes. In one demonstration, for example, a human head is replaced by a horse's head, something that you ought to notice. But if it's not where you're attending right now, and if the luminance and motion cues are artificially controlled so they aren't present, then that can happen and you don't even notice it.
I know that's really effective in like masking experiments, where you have one scene and then a mask is presented and then another scene where something is very obvious has changed, but people just don't notice.
Yeah, that's one of the ways of trying to control these powerful cues for attention. So one of the puzzles of attention used to be, and I think it's more or less solved now, it's nice to know that something gets solved. There would be these experiments showing you could attend to 40 things at a time. And suppose there were 40 different places or channels on which information might occur. People would be very good at attending to a target that occurred on any one of those 40 channels. So papers came out saying, well, you can deal with 40 things at once. However, it's also true that if you ever get a signal on one of those channels, you're likely to miss it on another one. So attention, you can monitor many things at once, waiting for something to happen, and your attention will be very efficiently summoned to whatever channel is active. But once you process something, I would say process it using the executive attention, the focal attention system, then your ability to process other things is really very limited.
So it's kind of acting like a radio on scan, and then all of a sudden it finds a channel and it's just focused on that one channel, ignoring all others.
It's a good analogy.
Over your career, you've noticed quite a few changes, I imagine, in the way we think about attention, and so what are sort of the current views?
Well, I think the big change really came with our ability to get into the anatomy of attention. And in part, this occurred in the 70s from monkey studies recording from single cells in the parietal lobe, where you could actually look to find cells that were involved in the orienting process. And then later, neuroimaging, first positron emission tomography and later fMRI, allowed looking in the human brain when they were attending. Well, that opened up a vast amount of new information. Particularly with humans, you can set up tasks and then see what happens when they perform those tasks and get a very good picture of the anatomy of different networks involved in attention. And so we could think of attention as an organ system, where just like other organ systems like respiration or digestion, there are different parts of the system that are involved in different functions. And there you can try to get some handle on the question from the anatomy, or you can deal with it directly from the behavior, and relating the two you can make much greater progress. So for example, for orienting, we now know many of the neural structures that are involved in orienting, and we even are beginning to know why it is that people with lesions in the right cerebral hemisphere have profound deficits in orienting, while people with comparable lesions in the left cerebral hemisphere don't. Because one component of that orienting system is lateralized. And it's the component that's capable of interrupting a current attentional focus to allow you to switch to another one. And that's lateralized on the right side. This is mostly the work of Maurizio Corbetta and his associates in St. Louis doing fMRI work. They've shown that this temporal parietal junction mechanism, which is involved in interrupting and allowing you to reorient, that mechanism is much, much stronger on the right side than it is on the left side. And that underlies this neurological thing that's been known for 100 years, that people with right-sided lesions will neglect the left side of space in really profound ways. And nothing quite like that occurs with left-sided lesions, although you can get deficits in orienting rightward with left-sided lesions, but nothing is as completely profound.
Now, what did the fMRI studies give you in this sort of study that lesion studies prior to that hadn't really revealed?
Well, it allowed us to lay out the whole network. So it was known from lesion studies that the parietal lobes were somehow involved and the frontal lobes were somehow involved. But the fMRI studies showed that there were two parietal structures, the temporal parietal junction and the superior parietal lobe. Now, I did some of those lesion studies and got it pretty wrong, actually, because by the time I was doing lesion studies, the methods for imaging the lesion were not nearly as well developed as they are now. So I had associated this ability to disengage from one focus to be able to handle signals other ways, and in the superior parietal lobe, based on my lesion data. But it turned out later from MRI data that really that's a temporal parietal junction. And later, better imaging data, better lesion data than I had, confirmed that. So now the lesion work and the MRI work has come together. I think it's a really important lesson for students because sometimes things look different with different methods. And it can be a big puzzle, and it's possible that it tells you that you're on the wrong track, or it's possible that one or the other methods just has given you a wrong picture that will get resolved. In this case, it's been, I think, pretty well resolved.
Mike, thanks a lot for this overview of attentional research over the years. And in our next segment, we'll start discussing a little bit more in depth the various techniques that were developed.